Was the move about getting away from the UK press, because the press is, you know, is everywhere, or was the move because you weren't getting enough support from the firm?
It was both.
Both.
I needed to do this for my family. This is not a surprise to anybody. It's really sad that it's got to this point, but I've got to do something for my own mental health, for my wife's, and for Archie's as well, because I could see where this was headed.
They didn't want him to be a prince or a princess, not knowing what the gender would be, which would be different from protocol, and that he wasn't going to receive security.
What?
It was really hard. Look, I was really ashamed to say it at the time, and ashamed to have to admit it to Harry, especially, because I know how much loss he's suffered. But I knew that if I didn't say it, that I would do it.
The request itself appeared harmless, almost diplomatic. But according to the dramatic scenario now unfolding, Tom Bowers saw something hidden beneath it. What Meghan hoped might reopen a carefully protected royal doorway could instead expose exactly how much influence she had lost since leaving Britain behind. It was not framed as a dramatic demand for everything to be restored. That would have been too obvious, too easy to reject. Instead, the request seemed carefully measured, something involving limited recognition, controlled participation, acknowledgement, or renewed access to a royal space that had once been familiar. On the surface, it could be presented as reasonable, mature even. But beneath that restraint was a much larger question. Why reach toward the monarchy again at all? Meghan's imagined calculation was simple. The Sussex name still carried enormous attention. Every royal connection, every family tension, every possible reunion could generate interest around the world. From that perspective, maintaining some connection with the crown did not have to mean surrendering independence. It could mean keeping a bridge open while still living outside palace control. For Harry, however, the stakes were different. Royal access was never only about status. Behind the titles were his father, his brother, his childhood, his mother's memory, and the institution that had shaped nearly every part of his early life. Any opening, however small, carried emotional weight. That was where Bowers' interpretation became more dangerous. In this dramatized narrative, he did not focus first on whether the palace might reject Meghan. He focused on what the request itself appeared to admit. If independence had truly replaced royal relevance, why was royal acknowledgement still valuable enough to seek? The palace, in that reading, did not need an angry statement. It did not need a public confrontation. Simply remaining quiet could allow the questions to grow on their own. And William's silence mattered most. A direct refusal could create a villain. Silence created uncertainty. That uncertainty reached beyond publicity. It touched succession, inheritance, family loyalty, prestige, and the invisible rules deciding who could remain close to the crown without speaking for it. Meghan might have expected negotiation, conditions, perhaps resistance. But Bowers' darker argument suggested the monarchy had discovered something more effective than fighting back. It could simply continue without answering. And that was where the danger began, because once Bowers stopped examining what Meghan was requesting and started asking why she needed it now, the entire meaning of the approach suddenly changed. Bowers' most damaging question was not whether the palace would say yes. It was why Meghan, after building an identity around freedom from royal restrictions, would suddenly need anything from the institution at all. And once that contradiction surfaced, every possible answer seemed capable of creating another problem. In Bowers' fictionalized argument, the danger was immediate. If Meghan still needed recognition from the palace, critics could say royal relevance had never truly stopped mattering. But if she insisted that royal approval meant nothing, then the request itself became harder to explain. Either way, the question followed her. That was because fame and royalty were never quite the same thing. Celebrity could create enormous attention, headlines, interviews, and global interest. The monarchy carried something different: history, inheritance, hierarchy, symbolism, and the weight of permanence. Meghan could command attention outside Britain, but a gesture from the crown still carried a meaning that ordinary publicity could not reproduce. And that made this request unlike a normal negotiation. There was no simple deal to strike. If the approach involved appearing near a royal occasion, gaining acknowledgement for the children, securing access to a family gathering, or receiving some symbolic recognition, every detail could instantly become loaded with meaning. Approval might come with conditions. Rejection might ignite another wave of damaging headlines. Even silence could become an answer. Harry made the situation more complicated because Britain was not merely a strategic connection for him. His father remained there. His brother remained there. So did memories of childhood, military service, royal duty, titles, and a family history he could never completely separate from himself. That emotional connection made Charles especially difficult to read. As monarch, he had reasons to remain disciplined. As Harry's father, restraint could never be separated entirely from private feeling. William presented a different problem. In this dramatic interpretation, he supposedly saw no benefit in another public Sussex battle. A confrontation could create sympathy, outrage, and endless argument. Silence denied all three. Meanwhile, Catherine's position kept becoming stronger within the royal structure, creating a quiet but unavoidable contrast. She was moving deeper into the future of the institution, while Meghan was trying to determine what influence could still be negotiated from outside it. And that was the contradiction Bower kept pressing. Meghan might want distance from royal control while still understanding the enormous symbolic value of royal connection. The harder she tried to explain that balance, the more questions appeared. But the contradiction surrounding the request was only the surface problem. Beneath it lay a harsher question. What exactly happens when someone asks to re-enter a system whose rules have changed while they were gone? The monarchy rarely needs to slam a door when protocol can close it quietly. Meghan's supposed request entered a world where invitations, titles, precedents, security, jewels, seating, access, and even photographs can carry political meaning. And Bower's warning was brutal. Acceptance might come at a price worse than rejection. This was where the story stopped being only about personalities and became something colder. The monarchy operates through hierarchy, precedent, and carefully controlled symbolism. Nothing around the crown is completely casual. A position in a room, the wording of an invitation, or the order of an appearance can quietly define status before anyone speaks. For Meghan, that creates a dangerous problem. Returning for any meaningful royal involvement would almost certainly mean accepting rules she once found restrictive. An invitation would not automatically restore trust, equality, or influence. It could simply place her back inside a structure where the palace controlled the terms. Where would she stand? When would she appear? Would she be treated as family, guest, or something in between? Would her presence carry official weight, or would it be carefully separated from the working monarchy? Each decision could send a message, and behind those decisions stood succession. Charles might still have emotional reasons to seek peace with Harry. A father can want reconciliation even when a monarch has to defend boundaries. William, however, would have another calculation. he would be looking toward the institution he is expected to inherit, and every exception made today could become a precedent tomorrow. That made Catherine impossible to ignore. Her growing ceremonial importance represented continuity, and any Meghan return would immediately invite comparisons over loyalty, status, influence, and public standing. Even royal jewels could become part of that silent language. A historic necklace, brooch, tiara, or Diana-linked piece could suggest belonging, inheritance, memory, or exclusion without a single official statement. Diana's legacy made those symbols even more emotionally charged because both sons remained connected to her story, while the objects themselves remained tied to royal history. Meghan's dilemma therefore became sharper. Returning under palace terms could reinforce the hierarchy she had stepped away from. But rejecting those terms after asking for access could make the entire approach look contradictory. That was the trap Bowers' imagined warning exposed. The palace did not need to defeat Meghan openly. It only needed to make the choice clear: independence on her own terms, or proximity to the crown on theirs. And once that choice became visible, the real risk was no longer hidden inside palace protocol. It was waiting outside, where public opinion could turn either answer into ammunition. The palace could remain silent, but everyone else would not. Within hours, Meghan's hypothetical request could be transformed into two completely different stories: a mother seeking reconciliation, or a former royal seeking relevance. Bauer understood that neither narrative could be controlled once the public started choosing sides. That was the next danger. The request itself no longer mattered as much as the meaning people attached to it. Supporters could see maturity in the move, an attempt to lower the temperature after years of bitterness and rebuild some kind of family connection. They could argue that Harry deserved room to reconnect with his father, and that Meghan was finally willing to allow a difficult past to soften. Critics would see something entirely different. To them, the approach could look like proof that royal association still carried enormous emotional and commercial value. They could argue that after criticizing palace life, Meghan was still drawn toward the prestige, history, and attention that only the monarchy could provide. That left her trapped between two responses: say too much, and she risked looking defensive; stay silent, and everyone else could explain the request for her. Harry would feel that pressure immediately. His instinct to protect Meghan could push him toward intervention, but every public defense carried its own danger. A sharp statement could reopen tensions with Charles and William at the exact moment when calm communication was supposedly most important. In Bowers' fictionalized analysis, escalation became the Sussexes' greatest vulnerability. One response created another headline. Another headline demanded another explanation. Soon, the story was no longer about the original request at all. The palace had the opposite advantage. By refusing to participate, it could make restraint look like discipline. William's silence became especially powerful because it denied Harry the direct confrontation he might know how to answer. Ambiguity was harder. There was nothing clear to attack, nothing obvious to challenge. Charles faced a different problem. Even a compassionate private message could become explosive if it leaked. Was it reconciliation? Weakness? A secret concession? Every interpretation carried consequences. Catherine remained outside the public argument, yet her name could still be pulled into comparisons involving Diana, the children, inheritance, royal jewels, succession, and the future shape of the monarchy. And Meghan began to see the deeper shift. For years, palace reaction itself had carried enormous power. Now, forcing a response might no longer strengthen her position. It could simply expose how much she still needed one. Then Bauer introduces the possibility that changes everything. What if the palace does grant part of the request? Not because Meghan has regained influence, but because accepting it, under strict conditions, could expose an even deeper weakness. A rejection would be easy to understand. A carefully controlled yes would be far more dangerous. Because if Meghan were welcomed back under conditions she could not shape, the moment meant to prove her enduring importance could instead demonstrate exactly where the modern royal hierarchy now placed her. That was the reversal Bauer's imagined argument made impossible to ignore. A refusal could be called cold, unfair, even vindictive. But limited approval would remove that weapon. Meghan could no longer say the door was completely closed if the palace opened it just enough to let her in, while making clear that entry did not mean restored influence. And that was where protocol became more powerful than confrontation. There could be no central ceremonial position, no prominent balcony moment, no automatic access to private royal spaces, and no use of official symbolism beyond what the institution allowed. The invitation itself might appear generous, yet every condition attached to it could quietly define how far Meghan's status had changed. For her, the choice would be brutal. Attend, and the contrast might become impossible to ignore. Refuse after seeking inclusion, and critics could accuse her of wanting royal access only on her own terms. Harry would feel the pressure even more deeply. Accepting limited participation could mean accepting that his place inside the family was no longer what it had once been. For Charles, that compromise might feel humane, a way to keep family ties alive without rebuilding the old arrangement. William could see the same decision very differently. Not reconciliation, but boundary setting. Catherine's role would remain unmistakable. She would not need to compete. The institution itself would define the distinction, and comparisons would follow whether anyone wanted them or not. Even historic jewelry could carry that tension. A Diana-linked piece might belong privately to a family member, yet wearing it in a royal setting could still raise questions about inheritance, legitimacy, memory, and who now represents continuity. And time only strengthened the palace position. New advisors arrived. New routines hardened. New public expectations formed. Every year outside the working monarchy created another layer of royal life built without Sussex involvement. That was why Meghan's supposed panic began to shift from emotion into strategy. She was no longer dealing with an institution desperate to answer every challenge. She was dealing with one that could simply keep moving. So the real test was no longer whether she could get a yes. It was whether that yes gave her access or merely revealed how much influence had already disappeared. That distinction leads directly toward the one person whose position could make the entire strategy succeed or collapse, because Charles may still think like a father, but William increasingly has to think like a future king. Meghan may have expected anger, resistance, perhaps even another palace battle. What she could not easily fight was silence. In Bauer's dramatic interpretation, William had discovered that refusing to react publicly denied the Sussexes something far more valuable than agreement: the ability to make him part of their narrative. That silence changed the balance. William did not need to attack Meghan, challenge Harry, or publicly block anything. In this version of events, his strength came from refusing to be pulled back into a cycle of accusation and response. Every argument risked turning private family wounds into another institutional crisis, and as heir, William had more reason than ever to avoid feeding that fire. His priorities had shifted toward continuity: Catherine, their children, royal stability, and the monarchy he may one day inherit. That meant every public confrontation carried a cost. The more personal the dispute became, the more dangerous it was for the institution. For Meghan, that created a frustrating problem. William could not easily be presented as the face of palace hostility if he never gave her a public refusal to point toward. Provoking him might only strengthen his distance. Leaving him alone meant accepting uncertainty. For Harry, the silence cut differently. This was not simply political strategy. William was his brother. Years of shared memories, grief, duty, and childhood history sat behind every unanswered question. A cold institutional response could be understood. Brotherly distance was harder to process. Charles remained the emotional bridge, but even that possibility carried complications. If father and son moved toward reconciliation, would Meghan receive the same access? Would forgiveness inside the family automatically restore royal privileges? The palace would have to separate private healing from public position. Catherine's quiet prominence made that distinction clearer. Ceremonial responsibilities continued. Royal roles continued. The institution kept filling the spaces once occupied by others without needing to announce that anything had changed. That was where Bauer's fictional thesis became sharper. Meghan's request could backfire because it revealed that controversy no longer forced the monarchy to respond. Titles, residences, precedents, inherited jewels, and ceremonial roles continued moving through the royal system regardless of headlines or popularity. The palace did not have to win every news cycle. Succession itself kept moving. And Meghan now faced a strategic dead end. Challenge William, and distance could deepen. Avoid challenging him, and she could not force clarity. But if William represents institutional resistance, Harry represents something far more dangerous, because the request that Meghan hoped could reopen a royal door may force him to confront everything he never truly left behind. For Meghan, the request might still be managed as strategy. For Harry, it cuts much deeper. Britain is not simply another market, palace, or publicity opportunity. It contains his childhood, his mother's memory, his father, his brother, his titles, and the inheritance he can distance himself from but never completely erase. That was why every discussion about returning carried a weight no ordinary negotiation could hold. Harry had built a new life with Meghan, and protecting that life mattered deeply. Yet leaving royal duty had never erased the people, traditions, and memories tied to the world he came from. Distance changed the relationship. It did not erase the history. The children made that conflict even harder. Questions about titles, family contact, heritage, and their place within the wider royal story could not remain theoretical forever. Every year added new distance, but it also made the unanswered questions more personal. Charles therefore became more important as a father than as a king. Royal strategy could explain caution, protocol, and boundaries. It could not fully explain the emotional pull between a parent and a son. That left open the possibility of reconciliation, even when institutional restoration remained far more complicated. William was different. The wound there ran deeper because it carried shared childhood, Diana's death, years of duty, and a future the brothers may once have imagined facing together. Silence between them was not simply political. It represented the collapse of expectations that had once seemed permanent. Even Diana's jewels carried that contradiction. A piece could cross an ocean and live far from the palace, yet its meaning still remained tied to family memory, royal history, and two sons who inherited far more than objects. Meghan could see the risk. If Harry's need for reconciliation became stronger, their ability to negotiate entirely on their own terms might weaken. Harry could see the opposite danger. Rejecting every compromise might eventually leave no road back at all. That was where their priorities began to separate, if only slightly. Meghan needed control over the conditions of any renewed connection. Harry increasingly needed something less strategic: human contact, clarity, perhaps even peace. Neither desire destroyed the other, but together they made every palace decision more dangerous. And Bower's imagined argument cut deepest here. The request did not merely expose Meghan's relationship with royal relevance. It exposed Harry's inability to completely detach from the country, family, and history that formed him. That meant Meghan would have to recalibrate quickly before strategy began to look like need. And that recalibration is where Bower delivers his final blow, because the hidden weakness was never simply whether Britain would let Meghan return, it was whether she could afford to need Britain's reaction at all. Bower's final argument cut deeper than any palace rejection could have. Meghan's weakness was not that Britain had permanently closed its doors. It was that the monarchy had continued changing without her, and every year of separation made returning more complicated, because the institution she once challenged was learning how to survive the challenge. That was the real shift. Meghan's supposed panic was not a public collapse. It was strategic recognition. The old pattern no longer guaranteed the same result. Once, controversy could trigger statements, interviews, competing briefings, and visible family tension. Now, the institution seemed increasingly capable of absorbing the shock and moving forward. Charles, William, and Catherine each had different reasons for restraint. Charles remained tied to Harry as a father. William had succession, stability, Catherine, and the future monarchy to protect. Catherine's strength came from continuity itself. Together, their silence reduced Meghan's ability to shape palace behavior from outside. Yet that did not make her powerless. Meghan still commanded global recognition. She could generate enormous attention far beyond Britain. The challenge was harder, turning that attention into something sustainable, without needing royal reaction to give each move emotional weight. Harry could not make that separation as easily. His father, brother, military history, childhood, titles, Diana's memory, and inherited identity all remained connected to Britain. Even Diana's jewels carried the same truth. Objects could leave royal residences and cross oceans, but their meaning remained tied to memory, succession, family, and loss. That was why Meghan's next move mattered so much. She could not allow it to look like Britain was being asked to restore what had disappeared. The stronger strategy would be to make Britain appear as only one part of a much larger future. In that sense, Bower's imagined exposé did not destroy the comeback. It forced Meghan to confront its contradiction before her critics could define it first. William remained the unpredictable variable. If he never responded, Meghan would have to build around his silence. If he eventually broke it, the entire conflict could explode again. Charles remained the emotional doorway because father and son could never be reduced entirely to strategy. Catherine, meanwhile, continued strengthening inside the institution, ensuring every future comparison would touch succession, loyalty, continuity, and Diana's legacy. So Bower's final revelation was not that Meghan could never return. It was that asking to return might prove the monarchy still possessed something she could not recreate elsewhere. Because the next battle will not be fought over whether Meghan can enter the royal world again. It will be fought over whether she can convince everyone, including herself, that she no longer needs that world to validate what comes next.